He was treated like an intruder on his own land. She thought she had the power to put him in his place, but when her lot went up for sale, he made a move so bold it left the whole neighborhood talking. Calvin Rowden wasn't expecting to be treated like a trespasser on land he'd owned for nearly 15 years. The air was warm that afternoon in Lakeway, Texas, the kind of day where the sunlight dances off the water and makes you think about nothing more serious than fishing or barbecuing. Calvin had a camera slung over his shoulder, a realtor by his side, and a quiet confidence that came with preparing to sell something you had poured time, sweat, and pride into. Then he saw the flashing lights. 2 sheriff's deputies rolled up the gravel drive, their patrol SUV sending a swirl of dust across the manicured lawn. Calvin thought for a second they must be looking for someone else. Maybe they had the wrong address. But the deputies stepped out, hands resting near their belts, eyes scanning the property as if Calvin and his realtor were strangers trespassing. "Afternoon, sir. We got a call about suspicious activity here," one deputy said, his tone measured but firm. Calvin blinked, confused. "Suspicious activity? This is my ranch. I live here. What's suspicious about taking photos of my own land?" The realtor, Samantha Cruz, shifted uncomfortably, clutching her folder of listing documents. "We're just preparing for the sale." "Everything's in order," she added. The deputy nodded but didn't relax. "Mind showing me some ID, sir?" Calvin felt his chest tighten. He wasn't angry yet, just stunned. He fished out his wallet and handed over his driver's license, the address clearly matching the mailbox at the end of the drive. Still, there was that sting, that subtle humiliation of having to prove he belonged where he had built his life. As the deputies ran his information, Calvin glanced toward the cul-de-sac across the lakefront. Standing there with crossed arms, half hidden behind her hedge, was Patricia Norwell. He didn't need anyone to tell him who made the call. Patricia was known around the subdivision for her constant HOA crusades. She complained about paint shades that were too bright, measured grass height with a tape measure, and once sent a written notice to a neighbor for leaving a kayak on their dock overnight. She wasn't just picky, she was relentless. Now she had gone further. Watching him on his own land, she saw something suspicious enough to involve the police. Calvin felt the mixture of disbelief and anger rising inside him. The deputies returned. "Everything checks out," one said. His voice had softened, but the awkwardness hung in the air. "Sorry about the trouble. Just had to follow up on the call." Calvin forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No problem, officer. I understand." But he didn't understand. Not really, because in that moment, he realized how easily one neighbor's petty call had turned into a public interrogation of his right to stand on his own ground. Samantha whispered, "This is ridiculous," under her breath, but Calvin just nodded, trying to keep his composure. When the patrol car pulled away, the dust cloud lingered longer than the deputies themselves. Patricia had already retreated behind her door, but Calvin knew she was still watching. That single phone call had done more than interrupt his day. It had left a mark. Later, as he packed up his camera gear, he muttered, "She's not going to get the last word in this." Samantha glanced at him, but stayed silent. She could see the wheels turning in his mind. That night, Calvin sat on the porch overlooking the lake. The water shimmered, peaceful as ever, but he felt none of it. He replayed the deputy's questions, Patricia's folded arms, the way his ID was scrutinized. It wasn't just inconvenient. It was degrading. He'd worked hard to own this land, and in a single call, Patricia had tried to strip him of that dignity. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the property line that separated his ranch from hers. Patricia's dock lights twinkled faintly across the way. That was when a thought, quiet but steady, began to form. Patricia had taken her shot. One day soon he would take his. But Patricia had no idea just how far Calvin was willing to go, and the moment she put something of hers on the market, he would be ready. Calvin Rowden wasn't the type to seek out conflict. At 44, he had built a reputation for being steady, thoughtful, and almost too patient for his own good. He worked as a logistics manager for a distribution company in San Marcos, Texas, a job that demanded precision and calm under pressure. If trucks were delayed or shipments got tangled, Calvin was the guy who kept things moving. He thrived in that world of order and accountability. But home, that was different. Home was supposed to be his sanctuary. The lakefront ranch he had bought nearly 15 years earlier had been more than an investment. It had been a dream fulfilled. He had grown up in a small rental home in Lubbock, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse. For years, Calvin promised himself that if he ever had the means, he would buy land of his own. Not just a house in a subdivision with cookie-cutter lawns, but a stretch of property where he could feel the quiet of open water and the grounding pull of trees under wide skies. When he found the ranch on the edge of Lake Travis, he didn't hesitate. Back then, the place had been rough. Broken fencing, a leaky roof, and a dock that had seen better decades. But Calvin didn't mind. He rolled up his sleeves, brought in local contractors, and spent weekends repairing, sanding, painting, and planting. Every nail he hammered into that house felt like a stake in the ground that said, "This is mine." Over the years, it became more than a home. It became part of him. Birthdays, cookouts, and family reunions all happened on that porch overlooking the lake. His nephew learned how to fish off the dock. His mother spent summers in the guest room, sitting with a glass of iced tea and marveling at the view. When she passed away, Calvin felt grateful she had lived to see him achieve the dream he once whispered about as a boy. That history was why selling the ranch wasn't easy. But life had shifted. Work was pulling him toward Dallas, and with his nephew grown and starting his own life, the ranch was more space than Calvin needed. Listing the property was supposed to be a practical step forward, a new chapter. Still, it hurt to think about leaving. One evening, before meeting with Samantha, the realtor, he walked the property line slowly, almost like saying goodbye. The oak trees rustled, the lake moved gently in the breeze, and Calvin thought, whoever buys this place better love it the way I did. But there was also something else weighing on him. The HOA. When he first moved in, Calvin hadn't thought much about the Homeowners Association. The fees seemed manageable, and the rules looked like the standard ones. Keep the property maintained, no wild parties, basic community upkeep. Over time, though, he realized that a handful of board members had turned the HOA into their own personal throne, and at the top of that throne sat Patricia Norwell. Patricia had moved into the subdivision 5 years after Calvin. She was older, in her late 50s, recently divorced, and known for her sharp voice at meetings. She didn't just enforce rules, she weaponized them. Calvin had watched her scold neighbors for leaving recycling bins visible for too long, file formal complaints about dogs barking, and once demand a neighbor repaint their shutters because the shade of blue wasn't community approved. Calvin tried to avoid her. He mowed his lawn regularly, repainted his deck when notices came around, and mostly stayed quiet at meetings. He wasn't interested in HOA politics. But Patricia always seemed to circle back to him, like a hawk keeping an eye on prey. When she saw him taking photos of the ranch, she didn't see a man preparing to sell his home. She saw a chance to flex authority, to put him in his place. And calling the sheriff wasn't just about suspicion. It was about control. That's what stung the most. Calvin wasn't reckless, he wasn't careless, and he wasn't disrespectful to the neighborhood. He had carried his weight as a homeowner, sometimes more. But Patricia treated him like an outsider on his own soil. As he sat at his kitchen table that night, Calvin thought back to something his mother used to tell him. When people show you they don't respect your space, son, you set your boundary firm. If you don't, they'll just keep taking. He rubbed his temples, staring out the window at the lake. Selling the property suddenly didn't feel like just a financial transaction. It felt like he was giving up a battlefield where someone else had drawn first blood. And in the back of his mind, an idea was forming, quiet, steady, and sharper than Patricia could imagine. But Patricia's call hadn't just pushed Calvin's patience, it had lit a fuse, and soon the smallest opportunity would give him the chance to strike back. If you asked 10 neighbors in the Lakeway subdivision about Patricia Norwell, you'd get 10 different stories, but all of them would circle back to the same theme: control. She wasn't just another homeowner with an opinion. Patricia lived and breathed the HOA rulebook. She carried the bylaws in a neat black binder, highlighted and tabbed, like a lawyer preparing for trial. And she didn't just bring it out at meetings, she carried it to barbecues, block parties, and once even to a funeral, where she scolded someone for parking on the grass. Calvin had learned about her reputation long before the sheriff's deputies arrived that day. Everyone had. One neighbor, Victor Hanley, still told the story of how Patricia demanded he cut down the wind chimes hanging on his porch because she claimed they violated the noise ordinance. Noise ordinance, Victor would grumble. It's a little tinkling sound when the wind blows. You'd think I was running a rock concert. Another neighbor, Judy Blanchard, had gotten into a heated standoff with Patricia over Christmas decorations. Judy had put up a large inflatable snowman in her yard one December, complete with lights that flickered at night. Patricia sent 3 separate notices claiming the snowman was unapproved external decor. Judy ignored them, so Patricia showed up at her door with her binder and a tape measure, insisting the snowman's height violated community standards. Judy slammed the door in her face. It wasn't just Calvin, then. Patricia had made it her mission to oversee every detail of the subdivision like a self-appointed sheriff. But she carried herself with the air of someone who believed she was saving the neighborhood from decline. She'd tell anyone who listened that her vigilance protected property values. To some, she was just a nuisance. To others, she was dangerous. Because Patricia didn't just file complaints. She escalated. Calvin had once overheard her tell another board member, "If people don't listen to rules, you call in someone who makes them listen." That line echoed in his head when he watched the sheriff's SUV crawl up his drive. At HOA meetings, Patricia's presence was impossible to ignore. She spoke with clipped precision, her voice carrying over the room even without a microphone. Calvin remembered one particular meeting 6 months before the deputies came to his house. Patricia had stood up, binder in hand, and lectured for 20 minutes about unregulated lake access and how certain homeowners were abusing privileges. It was clear to everyone in the room who she was targeting, even if she never said his name. Calvin kept his head down at those meetings, but Patricia's eyes always seemed to find him. Sometimes it wasn't what she said, but how she looked at him, like she was measuring him against a standard he could never meet. The neighbors gossiped about her endlessly, but no one wanted to cross her directly. Not because she was physically intimidating, but because she had energy to burn. Patricia thrived on confrontation. Once she had you in her sights, she wouldn't stop until she got some kind of win. "She's like a storm that never ends," Victor muttered once, shaking his head. "You're bored up for the wind, but she'll just keep pounding until you're worn out." Calvin tried to keep distance, but Patricia made that nearly impossible. The subdivision wasn't large, and their properties bordered one another along the lake. She watched from her kitchen window, her blinds shifting just enough for him to notice. If Calvin had workers over for repairs, Patricia documented every truck. If family visited, she noted how long their cars were parked. When the deputies questioned him that afternoon, Calvin thought about all the little incidents leading up to it. The notes slipped into his mailbox, the stern looks at meetings, the reminders of HOA rules. Patricia had been circling for years, and this time she had landed her strike. And yet she seemed completely unfazed afterward. 2 days later, Calvin saw her walking her dog, head held high, as if nothing had happened. A neighbor waved to her, and she smiled sweetly, no sign of guilt. That was Patricia's way. She never admitted wrong, never backed down, but what Patricia didn't realize was that in calling the sheriff, she had crossed an invisible line. Calvin wasn't going to forget it. She may have seen herself as the enforcer of the neighborhood, but he had something she didn't: patience, resources, and the willingness to wait for the perfect moment. But Calvin's patience wasn't endless, and when Patricia's next move placed a sliver of opportunity in his hands, he wouldn't hesitate to take it. The day Patricia called the sheriff's office, Calvin felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. It wasn't just the embarrassment of deputies pulling up his drive, it was the knowledge that his neighbor had looked at him, standing on his own property, and decided he didn't belong. That thought lingered like smoke long after the squad car rolled away. Samantha, the realtor, stayed quiet until the deputies were gone. Then she let out a low whistle. "Calvin, I've sold houses for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like that." You were literally just holding a camera. Calvin forced a chuckle. That's Patricia for you. Always got a problem. He wanted to brush it off, but the sting sat heavy. Samantha frowned. This kind of thing could scare buyers, you know. If she's calling the cops on the homeowner, imagine what she'd do if a family came to look at the property. That sank deeper than Calvin wanted to admit. Selling the ranch was supposed to be smooth. He'd already put money into repairs and staging, but Patricia had made it personal and public. The following evening, Calvin stopped by his neighbor Victor Hanley's house. Victor was out front grilling, a beer in hand. Smoke drifted up from the coals, and the smell of ribs filled the air. "Victor," Calvin said, leaning on the fence. "You hear about Patricia calling the sheriff on me yesterday?" Victor let out a laugh so sharp it startled his dog. "Of course I did." Everyone heard. "Man, that woman can't stand to let a day go by without stirring the pot." Calvin's jaw tightened. "She watched me like I was breaking into my own house. Deputies asking for my ID. Like I don't belong here." Victor's face softened. "I get it." She did the same to Judy when Judy's grandkids were playing in the driveway, called them unsupervised minors, and told the HOA they were a hazard. "She won't stop, Calvin. You know that." They stood in silence for a moment, the sizzle of the grill filling the gap. Then Victor leaned in. "What are you going to do about it?" Calvin didn't answer right away. The truth was, he didn't know. But he knew one thing. Ignoring Patricia hadn't worked. Every time he stayed quiet, she pushed a little harder. The next HOA meeting came 2 weeks later. Calvin walked into the community hall, a neutral beige room with folding chairs lined in rows. Patricia was already there, her binder on the table, her reading glasses perched at the tip of her nose. She didn't look at him, but he felt the weight of her presence. Halfway through the meeting, she brought up suspicious activities observed on private properties. Her voice carried, calm but pointed. "I've seen an increase in unauthorized photography, gatherings, and potential trespassing. It's a safety concern for all of us," the room murmured. Calvin clenched his fists under the table. She was talking about him without saying his name. He raised his hand slowly. "With all due respect, Patricia, I was taking pictures for a listing on my property." "That's not suspicious. That's just normal business." Patricia turned, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Perhaps. But when neighbors notice unusual activity, they have the right to call it in. Better safe than sorry." A man in the back spoke up. It was Alan McPherson, another long-time resident. "Safe from what, Patricia? Calvin's lived here longer than half the people in this room. You know he's not a threat." Patricia didn't flinch. "Rules are rules, Alan. If people don't want questions, they should avoid drawing attention." That was her power, turning a simple act into a supposed violation. Calvin sat through the rest of the meeting without speaking again, but the anger bubbled. Afterward, as he walked to his truck, Judy Blanchard caught his arm. "Don't let her get under your skin. That's what she wants. But between you and me, someone needs to put her in her place." Calvin gave a short nod. "We'll see." Driving home, he stared out at the water as twilight settled over the lake. Patricia thought she had won. She thought calling deputies, hinting at meetings, and standing behind her binder made her untouchable. But the deputy's visit had done more than humiliate him. It had planted a seed. He wasn't about to storm into her yard or shout at her in meetings. That wasn't his style. No, if he did something, it would be clean, quiet, and permanent. But the real opportunity hadn't arrived yet, and when it did, Calvin knew he'd recognize it instantly. In the weeks after the deputies came to his property, Calvin carried the memory like a stone in his pocket. Heavy, constant, impossible to ignore. He went to work each day, oversaw trucking schedules, fielded calls from warehouses, and smiled when he needed to. But the image of Patricia standing smugly across the cul-de-sac never left him. At night, he found himself pacing the porch, replaying the encounter in his mind. He could still hear the deputy's words. "Got a call about suspicious activity." Suspicious. That was what she had labeled him. Not neighbor, not homeowner, not man selling his house. Suspicious. His nephew, Travis, came by one evening to pick up some tools he had left in the garage. When he noticed Calvin's tense silence, he asked, "You okay, Uncle Cal? You look like you're carrying something heavy." Calvin sighed, leaning against the workbench. You ever have someone try to make you feel like you don't belong somewhere you've worked your whole life to get? Travis frowned. That Patricia lady again? Calvin nodded. She called the cops on me. On me, Travis, for taking pictures of my own ranch. Travis shook his head. That's low. What did you do? I smiled, showed my ID, let the deputies do their job. Calvin replied. But inside? Inside, I wanted to ask her what gave her the right to treat me like a criminal. Travis set down the toolbox and crossed his arms. You gonna let her keep doing that? Calvin didn't answer immediately. He rubbed his jaw, staring at the floor. I don't start fights. Never have. But I also don't let people think they can walk all over me. Not anymore. That night, Calvin pulled out an old photo album. His mother's face looked back at him from faded pictures. Her in scrubs after long shifts. Her in the tiny backyard of their rental home. Her holding his hand on his first day of school. She had been the strongest person he knew, and she had always told him, Calvin, don't ever let someone decide your worth for you. If you don't stand up, they'll take more than you're willing to give. Her words rang louder than Patricia's accusations. Sitting there with the album on his lap, Calvin felt a sense of clarity forming. The next weekend, he invited a few neighbors over for a small cookout. Victor showed up with a cooler of beer, Judy brought potato salad, and a couple of newer families drifted in, eager for friendly company. On the deck overlooking the lake, conversation turned, as it always did, to Patricia. She sent me 3 violation letters in 1 week, Judy said, rolling her eyes. 3. 1 for leaving a ladder leaning against the shed, 1 for having my recycling bin out past noon, and 1 because my grandkids left sidewalk chalk drawings too close to the curb. Victor laughed. She's got too much time on her hands, that's her problem. Calvin listened quietly, sipping his drink. Finally, he said, She called the cops on me. The deck went silent. Then Judy muttered, Figures. She's been itching to go that far with someone. Victor shook his head. That's crossing the line, man. But she won't stop unless someone makes her. Calvin leaned on the railing, gazing out at the lake. I don't want a war with her, but I also won't let her dictate how I live. Not after everything I've put into this place. Victor raised his bottle. Then whatever you do, make it count. Those words echoed in Calvin's head later that night. Make it count. He wasn't reckless, and he wasn't vindictive for the sake of it. But Patricia's call had forced him to look at his situation differently. This wasn't just about selling property anymore. It was about respect. Each morning after that, as Calvin walked the property line, he started seeing possibilities. He noticed the narrow strip of land Patricia owned that jutted into the lake, a lot she rarely used except for her dock. It struck him then. She guarded her access to the lake like a prize, flaunting it during HOA discussions as proof of her investment in community standards. He didn't know then how soon that parcel would come into play. But he knew one thing for sure. If the chance ever came to turn the tables, he wouldn't hesitate. Patricia had drawn the battle lines. He was just waiting for the opening. But fate has a way of delivering the perfect setup, and Patricia herself would soon hand Calvin exactly what he needed. Late one Thursday afternoon, as Calvin scrolled through property listings on his laptop, he stopped cold. There, on the second page of new postings, was a small parcel of land marked for sale. The address rang familiar. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing. It was Patricia's lot. He clicked the details. A narrow strip of land tucked between 2 larger properties, no house on it, just a sliver of grass leading down to a dock. It was her prized access point to Lake Travis, the same one she bragged about at meetings when she claimed homeowners without water rights should respect those who actually contribute to the community's waterfront value. Calvin leaned back in his chair, a slow smile tugging at his lips. Well, well, Patricia, he muttered. Looks like you've put your queen on the board. That night, he called his realtor, Samantha. I need you to pull details on a lot listed this afternoon. Belongs to a Patricia Norwell. Samantha hesitated. Patricia. As in that Patricia. The one and only. Her voice brightened. You're thinking about buying it? I'm more than thinking. Calvin replied. I want it, quietly. Through a holding company. I don't want my name anywhere near the offer until the ink's dry. Samantha chuckled. That's one way to send a message. But you know she's going to flip when she finds out. That's the point. The next morning, Calvin drove by the lot. Patricia's dock jutted out into the water, small but sturdy, with a bench at the end. He'd seen her there dozens of times, sitting with a glass of wine, watching the sunset, as though she owned not just her slice of the lake but the entire view. He imagined her face when she realized that dock was no longer hers. The thought steadied something inside him. It wasn't about pettiness. It was about balance. She had humiliated him in front of deputies, painted him as suspicious in his own yard. Now she was about to find out what it felt like to have something stripped away. Later that week, Calvin met Samantha at a cafe in downtown Austin. She slid a folder across the table. I drafted the offer. We'll run it through Rowden Holdings, the LLC you set up years ago. She won't see your name until the deed's recorded. Calvin opened the folder, scanning the pages. The price wasn't cheap, but it wasn't outrageous either. Patricia must have been looking for quick cash. He signed without hesitation. As he capped the pen, Samantha raised an eyebrow. You sure you want this fight? Because once she finds out, there's no going back. Calvin looked her straight in the eye. She brought the fight to me. I'm just finishing it. The waiting game that followed was brutal. Patricia had received the offer, but she hadn't responded yet. Calvin imagined her at her kitchen table, binder open, weighing the decision. Would she hold out for more money? Would she suspect who was behind the offer? Each day without an update stretched his patience thin. Finally, one Tuesday afternoon, Samantha called. Congratulations! The offer's accepted. Contract signed. We're closing next week. Calvin exhaled, a long, steady release of tension. He stood on his porch that evening with a glass of bourbon, watching Patricia walk her dog. She waved politely to another neighbor, oblivious to the fact that within days, her most valuable piece of property would no longer belong to her. It was almost poetic. She had tried to control him, to box him in with rules and threats. Now, without realizing it, she had walked straight into his trap. But Calvin knew better than to celebrate too soon. Patricia wasn't the kind of person who took losses quietly, but the real fireworks would come when she discovered the truth, and Calvin was more than ready for the storm she was about to unleash. Closing day came with the usual signatures, paperwork, and notary stamps. But to Calvin, it felt like more than a transaction. It felt like a quiet victory. Sitting across the desk from Samantha, he signed the last page, slid the folder forward, and leaned back in his chair with a small smile. That's it, Samantha said, tapping the papers into a neat stack. Rowden Holdings officially owns the lot. It's yours, Calvin nodded. Good. Let's keep it that way, quiet. No need to broadcast it. Of course, she replied, though her smirk suggested she already imagined the chaos that would follow once Patricia found out. That evening, Calvin drove to the lot. The late sun hung low, the water reflecting streaks of orange and pink. He parked by the roadside and walked down the path, the grass brushing his boots. Patricia's dock stretched out into the water, still carrying the faint smell of cedar from its last refinishing. He stepped onto the planks, testing their firmness under his weight. This dock, this strip of land, this access, it all belonged to him now. For a moment, Calvin allowed himself the pleasure of standing at the edge, looking across the water as though he had always owned this spot. He imagined Patricia walking down with her glass of wine, ready to sit on the bench like she always did, only to realize she'd have to turn back. The thought wasn't cruel. It was clarifying. She had made him feel like a stranger on his own land, and now she would feel the same. A few days later, Patricia got the news. Calvin was trimming hedges along his front drive when he heard the sharp slam of a car door. Patricia marched down the street, her binder clutched against her side, her face flushed red. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. You! She snapped, pointing a finger. Was it you? Did you buy my lot? Calvin set the trimmers down slowly. Patricia, good afternoon to you too. Don't play games with me. She hissed. That offer came from some company, but I know it's you. Nobody else around here would have reason to. Admit it, Calvin kept his voice calm, almost conversational. I don't see how the buyer matters. What matters is the property's no longer yours. You signed the papers, didn't you? Her eyes widened, her chest rising and falling fast. "You think this is funny? You think you can just take away my lake access?" "I didn't take anything," Calvin said, his tone even. "You put it up for sale?" "I bought it. That's how the market works." "You're petty," she spat. "This is revenge." Calvin tilted his head. "Revenge?" "Number. I just saw an opportunity." Patricia's voice trembled, though her anger kept her upright. "I'll take this to the board. I'll bring it up at the HOA. You can't block my dock." Calvin folded his arms. "Patricia, it's not your dock anymore. It's mine. And the board can't change deeds." She opened her mouth, closed it, then stormed off without another word, her heels striking the pavement like hammers. That night, word spread fast. Judy called Calvin. "She's telling anyone who'll listen that you pulled the rug out from under her. Honestly, I'm not mad about it." Victor laughed over the phone. "Man, you just became a legend in this neighborhood. Folks are saying it's the first time Patricia's ever been outplayed." Calvin chuckled, though his voice carried a weight. "She's not going to let this go." "No," Victor agreed. "But at least now she knows you're not someone to push around." For the first time since the deputies rolled up his drive, Calvin felt a sense of balance return. Patricia had wielded power through intimidation and rules. Now, with one stroke of a pen, he had reminded her, and the whole neighborhood, that control isn't absolute. Still, he couldn't shake the thought that Patricia's rage was only just beginning. But the real confrontation wasn't at her front door. It was waiting at the next HOA meeting, where the whole community would watch the battle play out. The community center buzzed with chatter long before the meeting began. Rows of metal chairs filled quickly, neighbors fanning themselves with folded agendas, murmuring about the latest drama. Calvin sat near the back, calm on the surface but alert. He knew what was coming. Patricia had been seething ever since the sale closed, and tonight she would take her shot in front of everyone. At exactly 6 o'clock, Patricia marched to the front. Her binder was thicker than ever, bursting with papers, tabs sticking out like flags on a battlefield. She adjusted her glasses, cleared her throat, and called the meeting to order. "First item on the agenda," she began, her voice sharp. "Property disputes and recent developments that threaten the integrity of our community standards." The room quieted. Neighbors leaned forward, already anticipating fireworks. Patricia flipped through her notes with exaggerated care. "As many of you know, I recently sold a parcel of land that provided me with lake access. What I did not anticipate," she paused dramatically, her eyes sweeping across the crowd until they landed on Calvin, "was that a fellow resident would manipulate this transaction to deliberately strip me of my rights." Murmurs broke out. Calvin stayed still, his expression unreadable. Patricia pointed her finger in his direction. "Mr. Rowden, you knew what you were doing. This was personal, vindictive, a hostile move that undermines the spirit of this community." Victor, sitting 2 rows ahead, raised his hand. "Hold on, Patricia. He bought land you put on the market. Nobody forced you to sell it." "That's not the point," Patricia snapped. "This was a targeted act." He used a shell company to hide his name until it was too late. "That is deception. Pure and simple," Judy spoke up from the side. "Deception?" "Patricia, he followed the rules. You listed the property, he made an offer, and you signed. That's called business." Laughter rippled through the room. Patricia's face flushed. She slammed her binder shut. "You people don't understand. This isn't just about property. It's about community values. When one homeowner acts with such malice, it damages all of us." Calvin finally stood. His voice was steady, calm, but every word cut through the room. "You called deputies on me for taking pictures of my own ranch. You made me prove I belonged on my land. You turned something simple into something humiliating. And you did it because you thought you could. Well, I played by the rules, Patricia. I bought what you chose to sell. If that feels like a loss, that's because for once, you didn't get to control the outcome." The room erupted. Some neighbors clapped. Others whispered heatedly. Patricia's mouth opened and closed, searching for a rebuttal. One board member, Harold Jennings, cleared his throat. "From a legal standpoint, there's nothing to debate." Ownership has transferred. The dock is Mr. Rowden's. The HOA has no authority to alter deeded property rights. Patricia's fists clenched. So we just allow neighbors to sabotage one another? That's the precedent we're setting? Alan McPherson raised his voice from the back. No, Patricia. The precedent is that you don't weaponize the sheriff's office against people you don't like. Calvin had every right to respond the way he did. Frankly, it's about time someone stood up to you. That last line drew applause, louder this time, filling the room with energy Patricia couldn't contain. She tried to gavel the meeting back to order, but the tide had turned. For once, she wasn't the authority. She was the spectacle. Calvin sat down again, his face calm but his chest burning with quiet satisfaction. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't needed theatrics. The truth had carried enough weight on its own. Patricia, red-faced and trembling, rushed through the rest of the agenda, barely disguising her fury. When the meeting adjourned, she stormed out without looking back, her binder clutched so tightly the edges bent under her grip. Victor clapped Calvin on the shoulder as they walked out together. That was something, man. You didn't just win. You showed everyone she's not untouchable. Calvin gave a small nod. She wanted control. She lost it. That's all there is. But as he drove home that night, he couldn't ignore the nagging thought. Patricia wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. But the ripple had already spread through the neighborhood, and now everyone was choosing sides, turning a property sale into a community-wide standoff. The week after the HOA meeting, the neighborhood felt like a divided camp. On morning walks, Calvin noticed clusters of neighbors talking in hushed tones, their eyes flicking between his house and Patricia's. The air carried a tension that wasn't there before. At the local coffee shop just outside the subdivision, conversations spilled over. Some residents whispered support for Patricia, claiming Calvin's move was too harsh and spiteful. Others praised him for finally putting her in her place. The split wasn't even about property anymore. It was about what kind of community people wanted to live in. Victor stopped by one Saturday, carrying a six-pack. He dropped into a chair on Calvin's porch. Half the neighborhood thinks you're a hero, he said, cracking open a can. The other half says you're dangerous. Calvin raised an eyebrow. Dangerous? For buying land that was for sale? Victor shrugged. That's Patricia's spin. She's telling folks you used some shady company to steal her lot. She makes it sound like you hacked into a bank account instead of signing paperwork. Calvin chuckled dryly. She's got a talent for rewriting reality. Meanwhile, Patricia wasn't sitting quietly. She started organizing small gatherings at her house, inviting the neighbors who sympathized with her. Judy heard through the grapevine that Patricia was calling it her community preservation circle. It sounded harmless, but everyone knew what it really was, a campaign to isolate Calvin. At one of those gatherings, Alan's wife overheard Patricia declaring, "If Calvin thinks he can bully me by taking my dock, he has another thing coming. I'll find a way to make his life miserable until he regrets it." The line traveled fast. Within days, Calvin heard it repeated almost word for word by 3 different neighbors. He didn't flinch when he heard it. He expected retaliation. What surprised him was how many people came forward quietly to support him. Judy dropped by with a casserole one evening, setting it on his kitchen counter. "Patricia doesn't scare me. She's been terrorizing this place for years. You're the first one who's shown her she can't push forever." Even people Calvin barely knew started offering quiet nods of respect. A young couple who had moved in 6 months earlier stopped him during a walk. "We don't really know anyone here yet," the wife said, "but we heard what Patricia did with the deputies." "It's not right. We're glad you stood up to her." Still, the division grew sharper. Some neighbors began avoiding Calvin altogether. The Johnsons, who had once waved every morning, now crossed the street when walking their dog. Another resident, Marlene, who had shared tomatoes from her garden the summer before, no longer returned his greetings. It was Patricia's influence, and he knew it. One evening, Travis visited again. They sat on the porch, the lake glowing in the fading light. "Uncle Cal, you realize you've turned this place into a chessboard, right? You and Patricia are the queens, and everyone else is picking sides." Calvin gave a small smile. "I didn't ask for that." "Doesn't matter." "That's what it is," Travis replied. The question is, what's the endgame? Calvin sipped his drink, thinking. The endgame is simple. Respect. She thought she could humiliate me. She learned she can't. Travis studied him. But what about peace? Can you actually live here now, with all this going on? Calvin didn't answer right away. He watched Patricia's dark silhouette moving on her porch across the water. The truth was, selling the ranch was still his plan. Dallas called, and this chapter of his life was winding down. But before he left, he wanted something clear. Patricia would never forget the lesson she had forced him to teach. That weekend, the HOA held a community cookout. It was supposed to bring people together, but instead, it became another stage for the silent divide. Some residents clustered around Patricia, nodding along to her pointed remarks. Others gravitated toward Calvin, quietly offering encouragement. The middle ground had vanished. For Calvin, the choice wasn't whether the neighborhood approved. The choice was whether he could look himself in the mirror, knowing he hadn't let someone like Patricia strip him of dignity. That mattered more than whispers. But the battle lines had been drawn so deep that even those who wanted no part of it were being forced to choose. And the question wasn't who would win. It was how far Patricia was willing to go to claw back her control. The tension in the neighborhood didn't dissolve overnight. If anything, it simmered. Patricia kept her distance from Calvin, but her disapproval lingered like a shadow. She still hosted her circle, still whispered about betrayal and community values, but her words no longer carried the same weight. Something had shifted after the HOA meeting. People saw her differently. For Calvin, the shift was deeper. He still planned to sell his ranch, but now the sale meant more than moving to Dallas. It meant closing a chapter where he had faced down someone who tried to diminish him. Every time he walked past Patricia's former dock, his dock, he felt a reminder that he hadn't let her define his place. On a cool Sunday evening, Calvin sat with Victor and Judy on his porch. The three of them shared stories, laughter, and the easy comfort of neighbors who'd weathered storms together. At one point, Judy leaned in and said, "You know, Calvin, people might argue about what you did, but I'll tell you this. You showed her, and all of us, that respect is non-negotiable. That matters." Victor raised his glass. "To standing your ground," Calvin clinked his glass lightly against theirs. "To knowing when enough is enough." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the lake shimmer under the moonlight. Calvin thought of his mother's words, the ones she had repeated his whole life. If you don't set your boundary firm, people will keep taking. Patricia had taken her shot, but in the end she had lost her dock, her access, and most importantly, the illusion of control. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about balance. About reminding everyone, even Patricia, that dignity isn't up for negotiation. The following week, Calvin finalized the paperwork with Samantha to list the ranch. As she gathered her files, she said softly, "You ready to let it go?" Calvin looked out at the water, the dock standing quiet and still. "Yeah, it's time, but I'm leaving on my terms." She nodded. That's the best way to leave. When the house eventually sold, Calvin wasn't bitter. He wasn't triumphant either. He was steady, the way he'd always been. Patricia still lived across the lake, binder in hand, eyes always watching. But she'd never forget the moment she lost the thing she valued most. And everyone else in the neighborhood had witnessed it too. The moral was simple but powerful. People who live to control others eventually run into someone who refuses to be controlled. Respect is a two-way street. If you deny it to others, you risk losing more than you ever imagined. Calvin didn't plan on being anyone's hero. He didn't plan on starting a feud. But when Patricia crossed the line, he reminded her, and the community, that boundaries matter. And sometimes the strongest message you can send doesn't come from yelling or arguing or trading insults. Sometimes it comes from patience, timing, and a quiet move that leaves no doubt about where you stand. So what's the lesson here? Stand your ground when someone tries to take away your dignity. Don't let petty power plays decide your worth. If you choose your moment carefully, if you act with clarity instead of anger, you can defend what's yours, and maybe teach a lesson that lingers far longer than any argument ever could. This story isn't just about Calvin and Patricia. It's about anyone who's been pushed, cornered, or made to feel small by someone who thrives on control. It's a reminder that no matter who stands against you, your worth isn't theirs to decide. And if you've ever faced your own Patricia, remember this: patience is power, and respect isn't something you beg for, it's something you claim. Thank you for listening to this story. If you want more stories like this, real, relatable, and filled with lessons that stick, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more powerful narratives that keep you thinking long after the video ends.